Hey everyone! Before this story pulls you into its grip, take a second to ground yourself in what you're about to witness. This is not just a tale of embarrassment or pride. This is a story about power, perception, and the quiet kind of dominance that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late. If you believe in comeback stories, if you believe that respect is earned and revenge is best served with intelligence, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a rise like this one. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where underestimated women rewrite the rules. This story begins in a place that looks ordinary to the outside world but feels like a stage to those who crave attention. A public professional gathering filled with polished smiles, shallow compliments, and people measuring each other's worth by titles and proximity to power. In that space, reputation mattered more than reality, and confidence was often louder than competence. It was the kind of environment where egos walked in before people did. I arrived with quiet intention. Not flashy, not invisible, but deliberately understated. My presence didn't demand attention, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I understood something many people never do. When others underestimate you, they reveal their true nature without realizing they're being watched. I had learned long ago that silence could be a strategy, humility a disguise, and patience a weapon. He, on the other hand, thrived on performance. His energy filled rooms not because it was powerful but because it was desperate to be noticed. He carried himself like someone who believed his position made him untouchable. His laughter was louder than necessary, his opinions delivered as if they were facts, and his confidence rested on the assumption that no one in the room could challenge him. That assumption would become his mistake. The mockery didn't begin as an explosion. It started subtly, wrapped in sarcasm and performative humor, the kind designed to get laughs at someone else's expense. It was calculated, intentional, and public. He singled me out not because I had done anything wrong, but because he believed I was safe to target. In his mind, I represented someone with no influence, no authority, and no power to respond. What he didn't realize was that power doesn't always announce itself with a title. Sometimes it waits. As his behavior escalated, the room reacted the way rooms like that always do. Nervous laughter. Averted eyes. People pretending not to notice because confronting disrespect would have required courage. No one intervened. No one corrected him. And that silence gave him permission to continue. He mocked my presence. He diminished my relevance. He framed me as insignificant, unimportant, and unworthy of being taken seriously. To him it was entertainment. To me it was information. Because while he was busy performing, I was observing. I noticed who laughed too hard. I noticed who stayed quiet. I noticed who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Most importantly, I noticed how easily he revealed his character when he thought there were no consequences. I didn't react. Not because I was hurt but because I was disciplined. I understood that reacting emotionally would have given him exactly what he wanted. Instead, I stored the moment away, filed it under memory, and let him believe he had won something. That night ended with him basking in attention and me leaving without spectacle. To everyone watching, it looked like another moment where arrogance went unchecked. But beneath the surface, a shift had already begun. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that my role extended far beyond what I allowed others to see. I wasn't there to impress. I wasn't there to network. I was there because I already held influence in places he didn't even have access to. And influence doesn't need applause. Within hours of that public humiliation, I began moving quietly. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Strategically. Every step I took was measured, intentional, and grounded in facts. I reviewed information. I connected dots. I assessed leverage. By the time the night turned into morning, I understood something clearly. His professional stability rested on fragile ground. He had built his confidence on the assumption that no one would ever question him, and that assumption had made him careless. Careless people leave trails. And by the time the sun rose, I had already reached the point where I could decide whether his actions would remain a moment of bad behavior or become the turning point of his career. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Because power isn't about retaliation. It's about control. And the next 24 hours would prove just how little control he actually had. The morning after public humiliation often feels ordinary to the person who caused it. He woke up confident, unbothered, and unaware. To him, the previous night was just another performance where he had dominated the room and reinforced his position as someone untouchable. He carried that same arrogance into his day, not realizing that power had already begun shifting hands. Meanwhile, my morning began with structure. No rage. No revenge fantasies. Just execution. I understood something crucial. True dominance doesn't rush. It prepares. I revisited the networks I had spent years building quietly. Networks that weren't visible on business cards or social media profiles. Networks built on results, trust, and discretion. These were spaces where decisions were made before announcements ever reached the public. He existed in the visible layer of power. I operated beneath it. As I reviewed what I already knew about his professional role, patterns emerged quickly. Inconsistencies. Overconfidence. Shortcuts taken because he believed no one would ever challenge him. He had grown comfortable, and comfort breeds vulnerability. What made this situation different wasn't just access. It was timing. I didn't need to fabricate anything. I didn't need to exaggerate. I simply needed to place accurate information into the right hands at the right moment. That's the difference between chaos and control. Chaos screams. Control whispers. By midday, the ripple effects had begun. Quiet inquiries. Subtle shifts in tone. Meetings that were scheduled without his involvement. Messages he wasn't copied on. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was intentional. Power rarely announces itself when it's changing. It reveals itself through absence. As he moved through his day, he likely felt something was off but couldn't identify it. That discomfort, the kind that doesn't have a name, often unsettles people who are used to certainty. And uncertainty makes arrogant people reckless. While he continued performing confidence, I continued closing doors he didn't even know existed. I wasn't punishing him for mocking me. I was responding to what that mockery represented. Disrespect in public often mirrors negligence in private. And organizations don't fear loud mistakes. They fear liabilities. By the afternoon, the hierarchy he trusted had subtly rearranged itself. Oversight increased. Scrutiny sharpened. Conversations shifted from praise to evaluation. His position hadn't been taken yet, but it had been questioned. And in professional ecosystems, being questioned is the beginning of the end. What made this moment powerful wasn't visibility. No one applauded. No one announced a victory. I moved through my day normally, calmly, without revealing anything. Because the goal was never to humiliate him publicly the way he had tried to humiliate me. The goal was to remind him of something far more unsettling. His success was not self-sustaining. By evening, the weight of uncertainty had settled into his environment. The same people who laughed at his jokes the night before were now distant. Watching. And when support disappears silently, it forces reflection. But reflection doesn't always bring humility. Sometimes it brings fear. As the first 24 hours approached their end, the balance of power had already changed. He still held his title for now. But titles without trust are temporary. And trust once questioned is rarely restored. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in the most dangerous way possible. Quietly. He entered the next day carrying the same posture, the same practiced confidence, the same belief that authority protected him. On the surface, everything looked intact. His title still existed. His office still belonged to him. His name was still printed where it had always been. But beneath that surface, the environment had changed its temperature. People were colder. Responses were slower. Eye contact didn't linger. The room no longer bent around him the way it used to. This is the moment most people misunderstand power. They think power disappears with a public fall or a loud confrontation. In reality, power leaves first in silence. It withdraws its warmth. It stops cushioning mistakes. It removes protection and lets gravity do the rest. He began sensing that gravity. Meetings that once revolved around his opinions now moved forward without waiting for his input. Decisions were made elsewhere and presented to him as updates rather than discussions. His authority still existed on paper, but influence, real influence, was slipping through his fingers. And influence is everything. Meanwhile, I remained invisible to his awareness. That was intentional. The most effective moves are the ones the opponent doesn't see coming, especially when they don't even realize they're in a game. I watched from a distance, not emotionally invested but strategically alert. Every reaction he had, every adjustment he tried to make confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't built for uncertainty. He thrived on admiration and control, not accountability. Accountability exposes character. By midday, the tension around him had solidified. Whispers replaced praise. Oversight replaced autonomy. The systems that once amplified his voice now evaluated it. An evaluation for someone who had never been questioned feels like punishment, even when it's fair. He began compensating, over-explaining, over-asserting, over-performing confidence. But confidence that needs to be proven is already collapsing. The people above him weren't reacting emotionally. They weren't angry. They were cautious. And caution from leadership is never a good sign. It means someone has become a risk. A liability. The word itself didn't need to be spoken to be felt. What made this moment especially powerful was that nothing about it could be traced back to me. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no visible hand pushing him downward. The process unfolding was procedural, justified, and entirely his responsibility. That's the beauty of control rooted in truth. I didn't destroy him. I removed the shield that had been protecting him from his own behavior. As the day progressed, something shifted inside him. Arrogance gave way to suspicion. Confidence turned into hyper-awareness. He started scanning faces, replaying moments, trying to identify where things had gone wrong. And inevitably, his memory returned to the public moment. The mockery. The laughter. The ease with which he had dismissed someone he believed was powerless. For the first time, doubt entered his mind, not about his actions but about his assumptions. He had assumed I was irrelevant. He had assumed I had no reach. He had assumed silence meant weakness. And now, surrounded by subtle resistance and unspoken judgment, he began to question whether those assumptions had been wrong. That realization didn't bring apology or remorse. It brought fear. Fear is what happens when people realize they underestimated the wrong person. But fear alone doesn't save careers. It only accelerates mistakes. As scrutiny increased, past decisions resurfaced. Not because anyone was digging maliciously, but because oversight naturally exposes patterns. And his patterns, once ignored, now stood out clearly. Shortcuts. Dismissive behavior. Risky calls justified by ego rather than logic. The very traits that had made him entertaining in public now made him dangerous in leadership. By late afternoon, the structure around him felt foreign. The same environment that once rewarded his confidence now measured it. The applause was gone. The laughter was gone. What remained was expectation. Expectation terrifies those who are used to privilege. Through it all, I remained steady. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't intervene further. I didn't need to. Because when systems begin correcting themselves, interference only disrupts the outcome. This chapter isn't about revenge. It's about inevitability. When someone believes they are untouchable, they stop protecting themselves. And when protection fades, reality steps in. By the end of that day, he understood one thing with unsettling clarity. His position was no longer secure. He wasn't falling yet, but he was standing on ground that no longer trusted him. And trust, once broken, doesn't ask for permission to leave. The silence around him had grown heavier, no longer passive but deliberate. Silence, when used strategically, becomes pressure. And pressure has a way of forcing cracks open, especially in people who built their identity on being admired rather than respected. He entered the day already defensive, though nothing had been said to him directly. That was the most destabilizing part. There was no accusation to argue against, no visible enemy to confront, no dramatic event to rally support around. Just a slow, methodical tightening of the space he once dominated. This is how systems protect themselves. Oversight increased without announcement. Requests for clarification multiplied. Decisions he once made independently now required approval. Every move he made felt watched, not in a paranoid way but in a procedural one. And procedural scrutiny is the most unforgiving kind because it doesn't care about ego. It cares about results. Meanwhile, his internal state deteriorated. Confidence turned brittle. Every success felt temporary. Every mistake felt fatal. He began second-guessing himself, a dangerous position for someone who had never learned humility. Arrogant leaders rely on momentum. Once momentum stalls, panic fills the gap. He tried to reassert dominance through control, tightening his grip where he could, asserting authority over those beneath him, projecting strength outward to compensate for weakness above. But pressure travels downward before it ever travels up, and the people around him felt it. Support eroded. Loyalty thinned. The same individuals who once mirrored his confidence now distanced themselves for self-preservation. In professional ecosystems, survival instincts activate quickly. When someone becomes unstable, others quietly step away. That isolation was the beginning of collapse. While all this unfolded, I remained composed and unseen. I didn't interfere. I didn't escalate. I didn't reveal myself. Because power doesn't need visibility to function. It only needs precision. And precision was already in motion. By midday, formal evaluations were initiated. Not framed as punishment but as standard procedure. That framing mattered. It meant the process was justified, defensible, and irreversible. No emotion. No vendetta. Just policy. Policy is ruthless. Every decision he had made under the assumption of immunity now faced analysis. The tone was calm. Professional. Neutral. But neutrality strips away protection. Without bias in his favor, his record spoke for itself. And his record was loud. Patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. The very behavior that made him feel powerful. The dismissiveness, the shortcuts, the performative confidence, now read as negligence. Leadership doesn't fear mistakes. Leadership fears repetition. By afternoon, the atmosphere around him had shifted from evaluation to preparation. Preparation for change. Preparation for replacement. Preparation for damage control. When organizations reach this stage, outcomes are no longer a question of if, but when. Still, no one confronted him directly. That restraint wasn't kindness. It was calculation. Because confronting him would have given him the opportunity to defend himself emotionally, to manipulate narratives, to cast himself as misunderstood. Silence denied him that stage. Instead, he was left alone with the weight of realization. He replayed moments. He retraced steps. And inevitably his thoughts circled back to the public mockery. Not because it was the cause, but because it symbolized his blind spot. He had mistaken visibility for power. He had mistaken laughter for loyalty. He had mistaken silence for weakness. And now those mistakes were costing him everything. As evening approached, he received the first unmistakable signal that his position was no longer his. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Responsibilities reassigned. Access adjusted. Authority diluted. These are the quiet signals of removal. What made this moment devastating wasn't the loss itself. It was the absence of resistance. No one protested. No one questioned the changes. The system accepted them seamlessly as if it had been waiting. That's when the truth settled in. He wasn't essential. He had never been indispensable. He had simply been loud. And loudness, without substance, fades quickly when scrutiny arrives. I observed this phase with clarity, not satisfaction. Because dominance doesn't require pleasure. It requires understanding. And I understood exactly why this outcome was necessary. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about alignment. Organizations correct themselves when misalignment becomes visible. And his behavior had made that misalignment impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the collapse was complete. Not publicly, not explosively, but structurally. His job still existed in name, but the power it once carried had been hollowed out. He was no longer in control. And control once lost rarely returns. What remained was understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't arrive with anger or celebration, but with clarity so sharp it permanently changes how power is perceived. This was no longer about him losing something. It was about the system restoring balance. And about me stepping fully into a role I had always held, whether visible or not. He entered his final phase quietly. No dramatic confrontation followed. No public announcement exposed his fall. Instead, his influence continued to dissolve until there was nothing left to hold. Titles were adjusted. Responsibilities reassigned. Decisions redirected around him rather than through him. The structure adapted effortlessly, the way systems do when they correct an error. And he became a footnote. Not erased. Not destroyed. Just repositioned into irrelevance. This is the part people rarely talk about. Losing power doesn't always mean losing a job. Sometimes it means losing significance. And for someone who fed on attention, that loss was devastating. The room no longer reacted to him. The space no longer shifted for him. The laughter, the validation, the deference, all gone. And the most painful part was that no one needed to explain why. Because the reason was written into his own behavior. As for me, my presence became clearer, not through announcement but through function. I didn't arrive as a replacement in name alone. I arrived as stability, as consistency, as someone the system already trusted. The transition felt natural because it was. I didn't need to assert dominance. Authority met me halfway. Influence recognized its source. The same people who once ignored me now deferred without question. Not because of fear but because of certainty. Certainty is the foundation of leadership. At some point our paths crossed again. Not in confrontation. Not in drama. Just in passing. And in that moment recognition flickered across his face. Recognition not of revenge, but of miscalculation. He understood then what he hadn't understood before. Silence isn't absence. Calm isn't weakness. And underestimation is the most expensive mistake a person can make. I didn't acknowledge the past. I didn't revisit the mockery. I didn't need to. Power doesn't revisit moments it has already transcended. It moves forward, leaving lessons behind for those willing or forced to learn them. The irony of the entire situation wasn't lost on me. He had mocked me publicly, believing he held control. 24 hours later, I controlled the environment that defined his professional life. Not through cruelty. Not through exposure. But through alignment with truth. That is the essence of dominion. This story isn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It's about consequence. It's about what happens when confidence is built on arrogance instead of integrity. And it's about the quiet rise of those who don't announce themselves until it's time to lead. If there's one lesson to take from this, it's this. Never confuse volume with value. Never mistake visibility for power. And never assume silence means surrender. Because queens don't argue for respect. They move in ways that make disrespect irrelevant. And when they rise, they don't need to tear anyone down. The system does it for them. This is Black Queen Dominion, where underestimation ends and control begins.